This is Rob Johnson, President of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with an old friend and mentor, colleague on congressional staff, Jamie Galbraith, who has been a professor for many years at the LBJ School at the University of Texas in Austin, done a tremendous amount of work on inequality, on the role of the state, modern monetary theory, you name it. He's got a perspective on it, and usually a very fresh and innovative one. And as you know, the Institute for New Economic Thinking is meant to foment critical discourse, and he's a key ingredient, always has been since our inception. So in Texas, you've just been through what you might call a vivid breakdown in the infrastructure of the social system, and how would I put it? I'll bet you guys had a big run to the sporting goods store to buy hockey skates and things like that. What happened in Texas? What really broke the electrical system and the hospitals and everything?
What broke the system was the structure of the electricity market as established by free market economists, including one in particular who took credit for the design, a guy by the name of Professor William Hogan of the Kennedy School at Harvard, who was quoted in the New York Times reportedly saying that the system was working as designed, and I think he was right. It was working exactly as it was designed. It was designed to the benefit of the generating companies, to the benefit of the fossil fuel companies, and to the benefit of the politicians that they funded. And we had a mythology of free market competition, and what Texans learned was, what does that mean in practice? What it means in practice is that without regulatory standards, the generating companies try to do everything on the cheap. And so they don't weatherize, because after all, Texas is warm most of the time. And a hard freeze like this maybe happens once a decade. So, the 9 years and 51 weeks out of the decade, they get away with it. But then that 1 week happens when they don't. And when they don't, two things happen. One is that you get an increase in demand, because demand is extremely inelastic. It doesn't respond to price, but it does respond to weather. And secondly, you get a collapse of supply because the equipment freezed up, froze up. And that was mostly natural gas, some renewables as well, but mostly natural gas. All of which could and should have been weatherized, because obviously most of the country knows how to weatherize electrical equipment. Chicago doesn't freeze up in a bad storm. So it's not like it's rocket science. It just wasn't done because the companies didn't want to do it, and they weren't made to. And the result of since electrical demand and supply have to balance, it's not a question of the prices making them balance, they have to balance. When the supply falls off, they had to cut everybody out. And then there's another problem. Then you go over to what is essentially necessarily a kind of socialist allocation of the supplies. That tells you have critical infrastructure, hospitals in particular, and they tend to be concentrated. I happen to live right amongst a bunch of hospitals, and so my electric lines stayed live. I didn't lose power because I share lines with hospitals. But the fact that I had that good fortune meant that many people in the city didn't get power back at all for days and days, 60 hours, and 4 days sometimes. And if you don't do that, and the temperature is between 10 and 20 degrees or below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, your pipes freeze. And so enormous costs, destruction of people's homes, and just damage, water damage, as well as the psychological damage, and in some cases the physical damage of simply being dark and cold and hungry, was inflicted on people as a result of this system. It was an absolutely textbook case in how free markets break down if there's not adequate regulation.
And the context of the lockdown and the pandemic, which you might call the anxiety is already at the top of the charts, that makes it very, very disorienting.
The pandemic certainly complicated things to a degree. I'm sure that's true. But I have to say, I was impressed by the extent to which people were prepared to step out and take risks. The response of ordinary people was really, really remarkable. But you know, you are just talking about a lot of people who have no place to go and huddled in the dark.
Now, we talked a little bit earlier just about the themes related to inequality and their cause, but the inequality in the access or the quality of healthcare is another theme that we hear a lot about these days. And is that just he who has money can buy, or what's the nature of the challenge, especially when how would I say, you being infected harms me. There's a profound externality in this system. What do we need to do to put things on a better platform, both from a humanistic point of view and a recognition of our interdependence?
Well, one way to look at this is to ask about which countries handled this pandemic effectively and which did not. And what you find, of course, is that the countries that did, and some of them are socialist and some of them are capitalist, but what they had in common was that they had maintained public health capacity. So they were ready on the first day, which was like the 3rd of January when the first reports came in. They were ready to close their airports. They were ready to mobilize, cabinet committees and to set up protocols for acting on this. That was true in Korea. It was true in Taiwan. It was true in Singapore. Hong Kong. It was true within a few days in mainland China itself. It's true in Vietnam, and those countries actually suppressed the virus. New Zealand did too.
Did a great job.
And then you have the countries which are wealthier, by and large, like ourselves, the British, some of the Europeans, where the healthcare system is highly structured to the kinds of ailments that rich populations have: chronic diseases, diabetes, heart diseases, and so forth. And where the public health element was very, very run down. Public health was a very minor piece of medical education. The funding for it was cut. The preparatory committee in the White House had been dissolved. And so they had nothing to offer except turn it over to a very decentralized system of governors and mayors to try and manage, and call on private corporations to do what they could, and the thing fell apart, and so we got clobbered. And the best we could do was to keep it from going to the whole population all at once. But we couldn't. We could only slow the spread. And lost 500,000 people so far, waiting for the vaccines to come and put an end to it. A terrible example. So what we need to do is to realize that we're not immune from public health crises, and we need to have a public health service. Now, the other issue that you were talking about is paying for people's health care. That's, of course, another separate issue. And obviously we need to have, the whole business of private health insurance is not up to dealing with the kinds of problems that we have. So I'm all in favor of a single payer system, but a single payer system is not itself adequate to deal with a public health crisis. You need to have the capacity to mobilize the population to handle all of the kinds of behavioral changes and protective measures that are necessary. And some countries did. We can see that some countries did it, and what they got for it, was fatality rates that were in the hundreds or the low thousands, not 500,000.
And if in the event that you were what we call a fiscal hawk, they locked down and their economies came back sooner.
Correct.
And so the need for fiscal stimulus was of less depth and shorter duration.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, they realized that if you dealt with the public health problem, you can get the economy back. We got the worst. We stalled, and it's an exponential process. It's, the thing That's multiplies right. it. So a few days, a few weeks, and you are in very deep trouble because it moves very fast on you. So you have to move quickly. You have to move in an uncompromising way. And then you get the benefit that you're out of it much sooner. I think that's a clear a clear lesson that even an economist can absorb.
What has surprised you? What have you been pleasantly surprised by? What have you been haunted by? What do you wish you were seeing in light of all the challenges that sit before us now?
Well, an economist is not normally pleasantly surprised by anything because the discipline focuses one's attention on the real problems. And this is a very interesting time to be an economist if you have your eyes open and if your brain is still functioning, which is unfortunately the minority situation in the field. But if you go back a dozen years, the period that we're living through, that we started living through really with the onset of the great financial crisis in 2007, is one which ought to be revolutionizing, finally, the entire field, because it is a series of developments for which the approaches that have been dominant for a generation or more are completely inadequate. They were inadequate to either anticipate or to deal with the financial meltdown. They didn't incorporate the critical perspectives that go back to Keynes and Minsky on those questions. They did not and have not been effective or useful in confronting climate change because they do not incorporate the kinds of the basic physics and biophysics of resources and the capacity of the environment to absorb emissions, which are fundamental. Which are raised in the early 1970s by Nicholas Georgescu-Reagan and simply never penetrated into mainstream economic discourse. And they have, I think, utterly misrepresented the role of markets as against organizations and regulation in a society. So this is an area where my father's work over many years is relevant. And again, we have an economics profession which has basically laid aside the work of almost all of the truly important people of the previous period and finds itself incapable of dealing with the crucial questions that we actually face.
Yeah. So, vis-a-vis, how would I say, the Trump administration, and then the follow-on, the Biden administration here in the United States, do you see Trump as a coincidence, an aberration, or did he somehow organically arise from the pressures and the despair that were going on in the economy?
Yeah, I think it's clear that Trump himself was a symptom of developments that had been a long time in the works. One way to look at this is that at the start of our careers, when we were both on Capitol Hill, mid 70s to the mid 80s in my case, this was a crucial moment when the United States made a decision through the implementation of monetary policy, through what Paul Volcker and Ronald Reagan did, to sacrifice its industrial heartland to its financial sector. And what grew up out of that was an economy which is prosperous on the East Coast as a result of basically the power, the global power of the financial sector. Prosperous on the West Coast as a result of the development of advanced technology and a number of other things, aerospace and information aerospace, entertainment on the West Coast. And in between, in grave difficulty, and particularly the Midwest, the upper Midwest, the heartland, has simply not effectively recovered from that transition in the early 1980s. And the result of that is, of course, people who were once working in that part of the country and are now probably mostly fairly elderly, and many others are very, very disenchanted. And they were open to Donald Trump's appeal, which had an enormous amount of myth associated with it. But the reason Trump was elected was that he was able to bring over a fair number of people who said to themselves, well, at least he's saying things that we understand that the Democratic Party is not saying, and he is rejecting things that the Democratic Party has perpetrated, including, of course, trading agreements and everything else from this trade. It's not entirely fair to the Democrats because it really goes back to Reagan, but it was a real phenomenon. Trump was the outcome of it, not the progenitor.
Yeah, and he, I remember saying, the system is rigged. It was like his mantra, the system is rigged. And everybody said, oh, I haven't heard that in a long time. People forget he beat 15 Republicans before.
Yeah, I haven't forgotten that.
And I'll never forget a gentleman who has the Dilbert cartoon, Scott Adams, wrote a blog post and gave a speech one time about how I took all these classes on hypnosis and learning and communications, and he and Steve Jobs were friends, and watch out for this guy Trump. And about a month after finding that quizzical kind of, wow, Donald Trump, this guy really thinks he's serious. I watched him in Florida, panel of 16 guys sitting next to Jeb Bush. And Jeb Bush said something to criticize Trump, and everybody cheered. And Trump said something back, and everybody booed. And Trump looked at the TV camera, and he said, ladies and gentlemen, you may think Jeb Bush was a popular governor here, and he was, and that's for some of the cheering. But what you got to understand is those people cheering and booing at this debate, they are the donors. Those are the people who are rigging the game here. Those are the Republicans who are getting paid for their support in politics. Those are the people you and I have to defeat. And I just sat back and I said, wow, this guy wants the nomination for president, and he just took on the RNC about the donors. I said, this is a different cut of fish. He is breaking away from what I'll say.
Well, there was no question they did. I think, I mean, we're now in 2021, and I think Donald Trump is, my view, is a spent political force. The general collapse that occurred over the last year has drained the aura that surrounded him, and the extraordinary upheaval in January has got to have caused reflection even amongst some of his most dedicated backers. But the underlying issues there were real, and of course they took a certain amount of political talent, which was authentic, to exploit them. We're now in a new phase.
Well, climate change was coming on stream as he was deregulating and defying the Paris Accord, and secondly, his tax cuts and deregulation were really what you might call a seduce and abandon, a bait and switch vis-a-vis the people he inspired to vote for him.
Oh yeah, I'm not so sure. I think what happened, if you look at the broad aggregates, was that there was a slow, steady, highly inertial expansion that began after the financial crisis in 2009, and it continued at about that same pace. If it was losing steam early in the Trump term, it was probably sustained to a degree by the tax cuts, and that carried on until the early part of 2020 when the pandemic crushed it.
Yes, sir.
And so, the important thing though is not there. It's that the formula that Trump offered no longer carries any conviction. And nobody believes that we're going to have a successful development of the economy from that foundation. And nobody believes that we're going to have a successful development from what came before. Right? Everybody understands that the reason we got Trump was that in the Obama administration, there was a kind of half-hearted, insufficient approach to a serious problem. There was not a structural approach, and of course, if there had been, there wasn't the political capacity to get it enacted. So the fact that the Obama people pulled their punches has created a situation which surprises me, in which President Biden has a margin of maneuver and a conviction about what needs to be done, that shows that he really did live through this period and remembers it, which to me is very much to his credit, because we're now seeing, even from some of the same people, a very different approach. They're saying, in effect, we have to put forward a program which is adequate to the challenges that we face. And we'll do it in two phases. We will get people through the pandemic with a very substantial program of income support and support for state and local governments and this kind of thing. And then we'll move and we'll try and deal with the larger structural questions which are going to which we're going to face. This, to me, it's a major breakthrough in thinking, at least for Democrats. One of the things one remembers, and again, it's good to be on this with a fellow geezer, because we're old enough to remember that in 1981, when Ronald Reagan and his crew came in, they demanded the moon.
Yeah.
They put forward a tax cut, which was their major agenda. That was 1/3 of the income tax, roughly.
Yeah, Julian and Company. Yeah, the supply side. Yeah.
No, that was froth. Murray Wheatonbaum, who was Reagan's chief economic advisor, said, to friends, to liberal friends, he said, we're really clever. We've got our Keynesian stimulus in place just before our re-election. They knew what they were doing. Yes. But the point was, they got a very big program through the Congress, plus a very big increase in the military budget. So it's Keynesianism on both sides. And when it proved to be more than they needed, well, they were able to make some concessions, and you got tax increases in 82 and 84 that were actually very large by historical
Graham
standards.
Rudman Hollings and
DEFRA and TEFRA, these two tax bills. And then ultimately the tax reform of 86. But the things that they did before he was reelected were substantial. And they could give that back. So they won coming and going. That's a political lesson which Joe Biden is old enough and has been around long enough to have recognized. And it really transformed things to have the Democrats playing this game, saying we're going to go and do it. We're going to put the kitchen sink into this. We're going to put everything we have on the table. When we get it, if it turns out, I don't think there will be a problem, frankly, because the whole notion that we're in some kind of inflation-prone situation is absurd to my mind. But if there were such a problem, you can deal with it when the problem comes up. Deal with the problem that's in front of you and don't anticipate ones that might or might not emerge in 3 or 4 years.
Right.
I mean, it's a sensible
especially
thing
when
to do.
the pendulum of distribution, meaning profit share relative to labor share, the pendulum is rocked so far in one direction that if you compressed profit with wages coming up, it wouldn't necessarily lead to inflation for quite some time.
Well, I mean, inflation is when prices are now set, and as they were not in the 1970s, on a worldwide basis. Energy prices, prices for consumer goods come in from imported from the rest of the world. Food prices are. This is a world market. So the ability of the United States to generate inflation is just much less. And then back in the day, we had there was a dynamic of wages and prices as a result of union wage settlements and the price of things like automobiles that were affected by union wage settlements, and those things are no longer major factors in the U.S. economy. So, and then there's the fact that almost all of our jobs are services jobs, and until service workers don't have any very much wage setting power. So it's just it's a non-inflationary situation. The one price that can go up is land, but land is not counted as in the price index, so it's not good land and stock values and so forth. But those things they don't show up as part of the consumer price index anyway. So it's very silly to be holding on to a model, the so-called Phillips curve, that was generated in 1960 in an entirely different world than as a basis for thinking about how things are going to happen now.
Well, you've been doing systematic work for a very long time now on the questions of inequality. And I know it's very evidence-based, very empirical. What kind of things have you seen change, say, since the time Bill Clinton came into power, 1992 to the present, which is 28 years? What are the structures, like you mentioned? More service workers, more, price setting in the world economy, globalization, probably a deterioration of unions, but paint a picture for us of what's going on with inequality.
Let's start with the United States, and the turning point that you mentioned is a pretty good place to start. What happened in that period was a bifurcation of the American economy. And you can see it very clearly if you look at the data as we do by region or by sector, that the stratospheric incomes that define American income inequality were generated in banking, they were generated in finance generally speaking, and they were generated in the technology sector, which was a creature of the financial sector. It was, and how does that done? That is done through IPOs and through basically through capital asset valuations. And you look at this and you say, God, this is a small number of people with an amazing amount of income, and that's what inequality is. We did a calculation for the late 1990s using income recorded by county, that's tax data. And we found that if you took out 5 counties from the data and pretended that what had happened there hadn't happened, the inequality across counties would, in all those last years of the 1990s, would have fallen by half. Those 5 counties, big surprise. Well, what were they? They were where you may be sitting, New York.
Yeah.
Right? And then 3 counties in Northern California, San Francisco, Santa Clara, and San Mateo, and 1 county in Washington State, King County, which is Microsoft. Mm-hmm. It's just extremely straightforward what was happening.
Probably Fairfield County in Connecticut, which was a commuter to New York.
Yeah, that's in the top 15, I'm sure. Yeah, but at least 5, you took out 15, it was basically the whole of it. You didn't get any increase in it. What was happening was enormously concentrated capital asset inflation, if you like. Mm-hmm. And then you can look at the pattern in later years. It differs, defense contractors and real estate and so forth, depending on what's going on. But okay, so that's the United States, by and large. A tremendous bifurcation as a result of the structural change in the economy, with most people working in the service sector just not seeing anything, not seeing much change really, not seeing any great increases, maybe not seeing enormous decreases either, but certainly the level of inequality went up dramatically. Okay, The bigger story is the world as a whole, and what we were able to establish, and this is the real, I think, innovation and important aspect of our work, is that you look at this at the pattern of evidence for countries around the world, and we have about 150 countries in the data set going back to the 60s, and you can see that the pattern of rise of inequality is driven by global finance. It's you can see this in the early 1980s. Inequality goes up in the countries that are hit by the debt crisis. Late 1980s, early 1990s, it's the countries of the formerly socialist bloc that were collapsing. Of course, inequality went up like a rocket there. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1990s onward, it's in Asia, which was undergoing liberalization. So where countries liberalized, where they were exposed to international finance, where they were hit by debt crises, inequality goes up. And after 2000, there's at least a pause of 12, 15 years because a lot of countries retreated from the neoliberal model and they had strong commodity prices. So you can see this as basically a global macroeconomic phenomenon. And that's the interesting thing, because if you ask what the literature says about inequality, it's all about labor markets. It's all about technology, education, trade in one specific place and some other specific place. And they never tie the story together to show a pattern that's determined across large regions, continents, or the world as a whole. But frankly, inequality is generated at the level of the world as a whole. And that then comes back to my basic view, which is that if you don't start your analysis of world from a standpoint of a essentially monetary analysis rooted in Keynes, you're not going to understand very much.
And Hyman Minsky, how would I say, had been prescient in that Keynesian kind of way, innovating himself, and wasn't really recognized until it had fully blossomed. Then people acknowledged his brilliance much more.
They've acknowledged it, but the question I would ask is, going back to the financial crisis. It's been 13 years. How many of the people who were right about this, who had the right methodological perspective, and who warned in advance that the financial system was unstable, how many of them have been given appointments at the so-called top economics departments? The answer is zero. They haven't done it. A few people who were already there occasionally give kind of a lip service nod, but frankly, the jobs still go to people who were wrong before, and who are essentially clueless about what's going on now.
Well, thank you, and let's sign off, and we'll come back again in a few months and take the temperature again. But I appreciate your time today, and try to stay warm down